Let me start there, Jessica. Ahead of the U.S. President Trump's State of the Union address, let's take a look at how markets have been behaving. What can we expect tonight?
Well, today we're seeing a very choppy trading session. The S&P 500 fluctuating between gains and losses ahead of the big State of the Union address tonight, trading near the little change mark for most of the afternoon. So what investors are really focusing on is, like you said, the State of the Union address tonight and what President Trump will be saying, and if he touches on foreign trade. Trump aides have said that the speech should be very positive and unifying. Potential topics to be discussed could be the border wall, which is a very contentious issue, as well as different locations and times for possible summits with leaders from China and North Korea. The other big question is, will we see another government shutdown? Legislation that helped reopen the government actually will expire 10 days after the speech tonight, so that remains to be seen.
Jessica, the United Nations has warned that a U.S. plan to raise tariffs on Chinese goods next month could have massive consequences for global trade. We've heard that before. They say it could trigger an economic downturn. Before we hear more from you on that, let's just take a listen very quickly to hear what the UN has said.
The intended effect of the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the U.S. has not resulted in increased domestic production, but rather will lead to diversion of trade to third countries. If the tariffs rise to 25%, what will occur is simple. They will limit trade from China. However, it will not be effective in protecting domestic firms. So suppliers in the rest of the world will be more competitive. Trade diversion effects in favor of third countries. EU will capture 70 billion of the US-China trade. Japan, Mexico, and Canada will capture over 20 billion each. And perhaps the ultimate irony is that Mexico's capture of almost 27 billion US of the US-China trade will represent the equivalent of about 6% of Mexico's exports.
And that's not a very pleasing forecast there, Jessica. Let me ask you, can you give us an update on how those negotiations between the US and China are going?
Those were really interesting comments, and the negotiations between the U.S. and China are really at the forefront of investors' minds, and it continues to be that way until we get some more information. We do have the March 1st deadline looming for the U.S. and China to either strike a deal or we see an increase in U.S. tariffs. That's an important date to keep in mind there. Trump aides have also come out and said that, President Trump really wants to strike a deal in order to calm financial markets. And the other thing to keep in mind is that U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer came out and said that if the U.S. and China do strike a deal, it's going to be little more than a memorandum between Trump and Xi. So that is also something to keep in mind. And
just before I let you go, as we always do at the end, take a closer look at the oil price. We saw it erasing some gains earlier in the day. What's it looking like from your side as far as that commodity is concerned?
Yes, WTI ended up racing those morning gains, erasing the morning rally there, and ending up posting a decline for the day, down about 2% at one point today. And that's on the expectation that we're really going to see a U.S. crude inventory build in tomorrow's government weekly inventory report. Analysts are calling for an average about a 1.5 million barrel gain in stockpiles, which is quite significant. The other concern is the economy, and that's also weighing on crude. One more trend in the energy space that I do really want to point out, because it's very interesting, is that the oil superpowers like Exxon, Shell, Chevron, and even BP this morning all have beat analysts' expectations when it comes to earnings, and they've generated a collective about $43 billion in cash flow from operations, even during crude's tumble in the fourth quarter. I just think that's something interesting to point out as we've been receiving these earnings.
Indeed, Jessica. We saw those energy-related stocks on the JSE also performing. Thanks very much indeed. Bloomberg's Jessica Summers in New York.